The American Old West often conjures images of rugged cowboys, dusty trails, and high noon showdowns. But beyond the gunfights and gold rushes, there was another side to frontier life, one filled with wine, women, and a whole lot of wild times. Saloon doors swinging open to reveal card games, whiskey flowing freely, and the sound of laughter mixed with the notes of a piano in the corner. It was a world where the pleasures of life were sought after as fiercely as fortunes. But were these indulgences a sign of moral decline, or simply the pursuit of joy in a rough and tumble world? Let's dive into the untold stories of revelry in the Old West and see if there really was anything wrong with a little wine, women, and a lot of fun. According to the strict social norms of the Victorian era, nearly everything about saloons and their attached wine rooms was seen as morally corrupt. These spaces were considered places of vice, enticing women into questionable behavior. In the Old West, the saloon was much like the European coffee house or the colonial tavern, a central social hub, but primarily for men. Here, men could gather for a few drinks with friends, often accompanied by gambling and the occasional brawl. The saloon was seen as a masculine domain, a place where women were largely unwelcome. The popular TV show Gunsmoke might depict Dodge City's Long Branch Saloon as being overseen by the character Miss Kitty, but in reality, women were rarely permitted in saloons during this period. However, if a man was looking for female company, he could find a dance hall nearby, as most saloon districts featured at least a few of these establishments. Dance halls offered the opportunity to dance with women, but for more private interactions, a man might visit a wine room connected to a saloon. Each saloon tried to distinguish itself with various amenities, such as well-ventilated rooms, meals available at all hours, premium whiskeys, and fine cigars from Havana. Yet, by the 1870s, only a few had set aside spaces specifically for women. One example was the Palace Beer Hall in Denison, Texas, which in 1877 advertised its newly furnished wine room as a cozy and comfortable space. The owner, Louis Libby, was noted for being one of the first in North Texas to welcome female patrons. The concept of the wine room wasn't new to the West. It originated in more exclusive settings back east. In private clubs, these rooms were elegant parlors where gentlemen could enjoy fine wines and cigars while engaging in discussions about current events and politics. A famous example was the wine room at the New York Democratic Club. As described by the New York Tribune in 1902, this room was a unique space where people from all walks of life, Supreme Court justices, policemen, horse trainers, and lawmen, mingled freely. In these wine rooms, social barriers were lowered, and it was common for someone to generously buy a round of drinks for everyone, marking the wine room as a place where people could relax and enjoy each other's company, regardless of their social standing. This setting illustrates how wine rooms served as a bridge between strict social codes and the desire for more relaxed and inclusive social interactions, reflecting the complexities of Victorian-era social dynamics. Western wine rooms aimed to create a more inclusive atmosphere by attracting both men and women. The very term wine room was a clever strategy to navigate around the strict Victorian social codes that frowned upon women entering saloons. This way, saloon owners could welcome female patrons without alienating their male customers or attracting negative attention from moral reformers. At the time, most men did not expect to see women at the bar with them, nor were they particularly enthusiastic about the idea. Recognizing this, some innovative saloon owners set up separate wine rooms specifically for women. These wine rooms were often located at the back of the saloon or on the upper floor if the building had one. They provided a more private and respectable setting for women to enjoy a drink. To maintain a sense of propriety, these rooms could be accessed through a separate entrance, often labeled as the family entrance or ladies' entrance. These doors typically led to an alley rather than the main street, giving an air of discretion. This arrangement was promoted as a suitable option for respectable individuals who might feel uncomfortable entering a saloon through the main entrance. The appeal of these side entrances and wine rooms was not lost on young women of the era. In 1904, a young woman explained to a Chicago Chronicle reporter how the ladies' entrance provided a way for women to enjoy themselves without crossing perceived social boundaries. According to her, It allowed girls to enter a saloon discreetly, perhaps with a male companion, to enjoy a beer or a soda. From there, they might be tempted to join in the dancing, as she had done, thinking it harmless. This perspective highlights how these spaces offered a sense of freedom and social opportunity for women who were otherwise restricted by the norms of the time. However, not everyone viewed these wine rooms in a positive light. Many conservative lawmen and moralists of the era were critical of the concept, believing that these rooms led women astray. Some law enforcement officers expressed strong disapproval, describing wine rooms as morally questionable places. This sentiment was echoed in editorials, such as one in a Kansas newspaper, which argued that wine rooms could lead young women down a slippery slope of poor choices and compromised morals. These wine rooms reflect the tension between traditional Victorian values and the evolving social dynamics of the Old West. They offered a space where women could engage in public social life, challenging the conventional separation of genders in public spaces. At the same time, they became a focal point of moral debates, illustrating the complexities of changing social norms at the turn of the century. While high-end wine rooms might have aimed to align with Victorian sensibilities, many of the more modest establishments were little more than venues for questionable activities, sometimes serving as extensions of brothels attached to saloons. A law enforcement officer from Texas once shared with a Fort Worth Telegram reporter a description of some of the worst examples. These places were often covered in sawdust, divided into tiny closet-sized areas by partitions that were just tall enough to offer a minimal amount of privacy. What happened behind these partitions depended largely on the desires of the patrons, offering them a space to engage in private activities out of the public eye. This model of the wine room quickly became popular in cities across the West, including places like Fort Worth, Dodge City, Denver, and Los Angeles. Essentially any town with a vice district and a population of women who could be drawn into such enterprises. It turned out that many male patrons preferred to drink wine or claret rather than the more typical whiskey or beer. Moreover, like their female counterparts, they appreciated the privacy that these secluded rooms provided, away from the hustle and scrutiny of the main saloon area. Despite the satirical comments from newspaper writers who mocked those who indulged in wine drinking, saloon owners could not afford to ignore this growing market. Wine was becoming increasingly popular, and those in the business of selling alcohol recognized the opportunity. A Chicago bartender noted to a reporter in 1885 that wine was gradually replacing beer among certain groups of drinkers. California wine, which was only slightly more expensive than beer, attracted a clientele that considered themselves of a higher class than those frequenting beer saloons. However, it's important to note that these wine rooms were not places for wine connoisseurs. Most bartenders had little knowledge about the different types of wine, such as Bordeaux or Chablis, and neither did their customers. The wine served in these establishments was often not of the best quality. It was commonly adulterated with substances like glucose, caramel, and even coal tar to enhance its color and flavor. A Chicago bartender explained that many industries had their tricks, and wine was no exception. He noted that while much of the manipulated wine was imported from Europe, California wines were generally purer. However, these wines were often younger and less matured, lacking the depth and character that aging could provide. This aspect of wine room culture reflects the broader dynamics of the Old West, where economic opportunity often clashed with moral and social expectations. The popularity of wine rooms shows how the tastes and preferences of the population were evolving, and how businesses adapted to these changes, even if it meant bending some rules. These establishments catered to a demand for privacy and a more refined drinking experience, reflecting the complex interplay of social class, gender roles, and economic interests in the rapidly growing towns of the American frontier. Seeing the potential profit, saloon owners increasingly dedicated more space to wine rooms. Saloons built around the turn of the 20th century often included wine rooms in their design plans. Typically, there was a single door at the back of the main bar area, leading to a hallway, which connected several rooms. Each room was furnished with a table, chairs, and sometimes a sofa, and a few even had enough space for dancing. A separate entrance at the end of the hallway served as the ladies' entrance, allowing women to enter discreetly. Bartenders or waiters would use the door connecting the bar to the hallway to bring drinks and food to the patrons, always knocking first to ensure privacy. As indoor plumbing became more common, wine rooms were equipped with their own water closets, mainly for the convenience of female customers. The mingling of men and women in these private rooms often led to predictable outcomes: romantic encounters and occasionally violence. The latter was usually a consequence of the former. An 1889 poem published in the Dallas Morning News tells the story of a woman named El Paso Mommy, who frequently visited wine rooms and associated with a dangerous crowd. She carried a knife and was known to defend herself fiercely. According to the poem, Mommy ultimately sacrificed her life to save a young woman who had been lured into a wine room by two unsavory characters. The girl was saved, but Mommy lost her life in the process. This poem served as both a cautionary tale and a revealing glimpse into what went on in these wine rooms. Other accounts depicted these spaces in less romantic terms, highlighting the darker side of wine room culture. Violence often erupted due to the complex relationships between the men and women who frequented these rooms. Court records from the era reveal that some of the patrons were married men looking for extramarital encounters, while others were women seeking an escape from unhappy marriages. If a spouse or partner discovered the affair, conflict was inevitable. One such incident occurred on June 19, 1901, when Henry Moore, a railroad foreman in Fort Worth, tracked his wife Emma to a wine room in the city's notorious red light district known as Hell's Half Acre. There he found her with another man, H. Russell. In a fit of rage, Henry attacked both with a pistol, resulting in their deaths before surrendering to the police. Incidents like this contributed to the growing perception of wine rooms as places of moral decay and corruption. In response to such incidents, some towns, like Flagstaff in the Arizona Territory, passed laws specifically banning any prostitute, courtesan, or woman of ill repute from entering wine rooms. Ironically, these very restrictions underscored the original purpose of wine rooms: to provide a space for people to escape societal judgment and indulge in behavior that was otherwise frowned upon. These spaces reflected the ongoing struggle between the desire for personal freedom and the social constraints of the time. Wine rooms were the scene of more than just illicit affairs and violent encounters. These secluded spaces also became hotspots for crimes like drugging and robbery. Wealthy men who ventured into these rooms for private meetings with women of questionable repute found themselves vulnerable. For instance, one jeweler from out of town, who visited Fort Worth on a Saturday night, woke up the next morning with a severe headache and discovered that his female companion had stolen $150 worth of jewelry and $10 in cash. He later told police that the woman had approached him while he was drinking in the wine room and had asked him to buy her a drink. According to the Morning Register, his chivalrous nature led him to share a drink or two with her. Suddenly feeling lightheaded, he asked the bartender to call a carriage to take him back to his hotel. He couldn't remember the woman's appearance clearly and left town in a hurry. Such incidents were not isolated, as police across the region reported numerous similar cases. Women, too, sometimes found themselves victimized in these wine rooms. In 1902, an unidentified woman who had entered a wine room at the back of Henry O'Hara's Saloon in Chicago for a private meeting with two men was later found beaten and strangled. Investigations revealed that she had been drugged before being killed. The Chicago Journal noted that her fashionable clothing suggested she was not a regular visitor to such places, implying she had been lured under false pretenses. By the end of the 19th century, authorities in Fort Worth concluded that the problems associated with wine rooms were even more troubling than the issues posed by saloons, which had long been a source of concern. While drinking, gambling, and brawling were seen as disruptive, the moral degradation that occurred in the back rooms of wine rooms was considered a more significant threat to the community. On the night of September 20th, 1902, Fort Worth officer C.B. Maddox intervened in a potentially dangerous situation when he found two 12-year-old girls in a wine room in a disreputable part of town. The girls claimed they had been enticed there by a woman who promised them lunch and a soda. Instead, she gave them beer, and it was at this point that the police arrived. While the girls' story seemed implausible, the incident heightened concerns about the influence of wine rooms. Reports from various cities indicated that the trend of women drinking in saloons was on the rise, as noted by the Chicago Chronicle in 1904. Frustrated by the lack of action from state or territorial legislatures, some cities took matters into their own hands by enacting ordinances that further restricted or outright banned wine rooms. Those who benefited financially from these establishments, such as saloon owners, bartender unions, and liquor wholesalers, opposed these new regulations. But it was clear that public sentiment was turning against wine rooms. The growing awareness of the issues surrounding wine rooms reflected broader societal anxieties about the changing roles and behaviors of men and women in the early 20th century. The struggle to regulate these spaces highlights the tensions between maintaining social order and adapting to new social norms. Soon, cities throughout the West began taking action against wine rooms. Police conducted raids, arresting anyone they found inside. Since these raids often apprehended as many men as women, authorities suspected that more than just drinking was happening behind these closed doors. This led them to label any woman found in a wine room as immoral. In response to their arrests, many women offered seemingly innocent explanations for their presence. In a 1908 case reported by Oregon's Morning Historian, a woman caught entering a wine room claimed she had only stopped in to use the restroom, while her male companion insisted he was just chatting with the bartender. The prosecution, however, questioned the woman's credibility, noting how she had casually walked into the establishment and immediately headed to the wine room, as if she were quite familiar with the place. At the time, this was viewed as strong evidence of guilty intent. Despite the efforts of prosecutors, the all-male juries were not always convinced to convict under the existing ordinances, making outcomes in police court cases unpredictable. Authorities began to view the activities in wine rooms as more harmful to society than traditional vices like drinking, gambling, and brawling. In Texas, state authorities took a firmer stance against wine rooms. In 1905, the 29th legislature introduced a bill aimed at prohibiting gambling and wine rooms and saloons, and banning women and minors from entering altogether. Motivated by the growing Prohibition movement, lawmakers also considered raising the licensing fees for saloons to levels that would make it difficult for smaller operators to stay in business. The proposed bill created a divide among saloon owners. Larger establishments that could afford to comply with the new regulations supported the changes, while smaller saloon operators, who lacked the resources to meet the higher fees and restrictions, voiced strong opposition. A representative of Fort Worth's small saloon owners expressed their concerns to the Evening Telegram, arguing, "It's not fair to discriminate against the small saloon man, many of whom don't allow even simple games like dominoes to be played or have wine rooms or gambling areas in favor of larger saloons that have more financial means." This pushback from smaller saloon owners highlighted the economic and social challenges of enforcing morality through legislation. As the debate over wine rooms continued, it became clear that the issue was not just about public morality, but also about economic survival and the power dynamics within the saloon industry. The biggest issue with state law was that it wasn't illegal for a woman to enter a saloon or even have a few drinks. One afternoon in early 1906, the owner of Fort Worth's Senate Saloon was stunned when two elegantly dressed women walked in and demanded, "Give us a drink, bartender." When he refused, they protested loudly before leaving in frustration. He later told the Telegram that while these women had the right to enter, he also had the right to refuse service for reasons of decency. Caught between moral reformers and legal boundaries, authorities hesitated to intervene, viewing the situation as a civil issue. In the summer of that year, Police Chief James Maddox made it clear that he wouldn't concern himself with wine rooms or their patrons as long as they didn't violate city ordinances. That is, as long as these activities didn't cross into the territory of operating disorderly houses. The Telegram dryly noted the bureaucratic passing of responsibility. County Prosecutor R.E.L. Roy said it was up to the police pointed to the county prosecutor and the sheriff's department claimed it wasn't their responsibility unless a formal complaint was filed. This cycle of inaction was a textbook example of evading responsibility. However, it seems the growing pressure eventually reached the police as they began raiding wine rooms that September, arresting any women they found. City leaders appeared determined to enforce gender segregation at the saloon door. The problem was finding a legal basis for this. While laws prohibited public drunkenness and illicit liaisons, they didn't ban women from simply entering saloons. Prosecuting a woman who was quietly having a drink in a secluded wine room was challenging. Thus, the campaign against wine rooms struggled to gain legal traction. Later that year, two significant political moves set the stage for the decline of wine rooms in Fort Worth. First, the city adopted the commission form of government, which included strict regulations against saloons. Second, the state legislature passed the Baskin-McGregor Law, which explicitly banned serving liquor to women in wine rooms, forbade the presence of immoral women in any saloon, and prohibited employing women except for wives or close relatives. These developments shifted the narrative. As a letter to the Dallas Morning News once summarized, the belief that a saloon is a public place in which a man sells liquor to all who wish to buy no longer held sway. With both state and local governments now targeting wine rooms, enforcement became inevitable. Wine rooms were placed under the jurisdiction of county courts, and city police were instructed to close them down. The remaining question was whether offenders would face trial in county court or police court. These changes marked a turning point, signaling the end of the wine room era in the Old West. Despite the renewed crackdown on wine rooms, they persisted in Hell's Half Acre and other vice districts, albeit no longer pretending to offer gender equality. Instead, they were increasingly seen as alternatives to cribs, the notorious quickie houses of prostitution that once lined the side streets of Lower Rusk. In fact, some viewed wine rooms as even more morally reprehensible than cribs due to their clientele. Unlike cribs, which were frequented by individuals from the fringes of society, wine rooms became associated with respectable men and women who could otherwise be seen as falling from grace. Wine rooms became infamous as places where women could be led into moral decline. An 1898 committee addressing the issue described how women were often brought to these establishments by their companions, given alcohol to dull their senses, and then exploited. Harry Say, a proponent of designated saloon districts, claimed that wine rooms were a significant cause of marital infidelity and subsequent divorces. In a detailed 1906 letter to the Dallas City Council published in the Morning News, Say argued that the journey to a wine room often began with a housewife ordering drinks to be delivered from a saloon, progressing to visiting the saloon herself, and eventually finding her way into the wine room. The Telegram echoed this sentiment, predicting inevitable ruin for those who entered these establishments. Even after the 1907 reforms, wine rooms continued to operate in Hell's Half Acre as popular rendezvous spots. The authorities, however, turned a blind eye to them as long as they remained confined to this notorious district where vice laws were often suspended under the guise of progressive law enforcement. This tolerance began to wane in 1909 when the city undertook efforts to clean up Hell's Half Acre. The first move was to expel saloons from the district, followed by a ban on women deemed immoral. These actions significantly diminished the presence of vice in the acre, marking the beginning of its decline. Despite the reduction in visible vice within the district, Fort Worth continued to harbor illicit activities, suggesting that while Hell's Half Acre may have lost its prominence, the city's underbelly remained active. Across the region, wine rooms came under intense scrutiny from investigative journalists working for major newspapers. These exposés often provided intricate details about the operations of these establishments. For instance, Frank Goings' saloon and wine room in Los Angeles, located on the ground floor of a prominent brick building, was the subject of a thorough investigation. The building also housed a hotel on its upper floors. According to the Los Angeles Herald, access to the wine room was through a side door with a curtained glass upper sash. Inside, the layout featured a central aisle flanked by curtain booths, each equipped with a table and seating. Another door led to the saloon, and a private staircase provided access to the hotel above. Journalists observed men entering these booths with young women, some still in their teens. Waiters from the barroom would deliver drinks to the booths, where the men would then use the alcohol to lure the women upstairs. The reporters chose not to describe further, likely to protect the sensibilities of their audience. The implication was clear. Wine rooms were more than just a shady side of the saloon industry. They contributed significantly to the establishment's negative reputation. The illicit activities conducted within these spaces, particularly those involving young women, further tarnished the image of saloons beyond the mere act of drinking. The advent of Prohibition in 1919 and the subsequent ratification of the 18th Amendment marked a turning point, effectively putting an end to wine rooms. The law shut down all legal saloons for 14 years. When saloons finally reopened in 1933, the social landscape had shifted significantly. Women began to frequent bars openly, standing side by side with men, often with a cigarette in one hand and a drink in the other. This transformation makes it difficult today to imagine a time when saloons enforced gender segregation as a part of their standard practice. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden corners of history, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for more intriguing stories and untold truths about the Old West. Your support keeps the history alive and helps us bring more fascinating content your way. Cheers to exploring the past.